got character. Got that flair.
Got my pipe cleaned out after all, huh? Well, we're very much in a dry environment now compared to Wind River. The precipitation at Wind River averages pretty close to 100 inches a year. Of course, it has a dry summer, and it has quite a dry summer, relatively speaking, but it is definitely a wet side forest, moist forest. We're now well east of the crest. I'm guessing the annual precipitation here is probably on the order of 35 to 40 inches a year, and a lot of it comes in the form of snow. So we have three major players here. You know, we have Ponderosa pine, we have grand fir, and we have Douglas fir. So there's a Dougie. A lot of these trees here are these grand firs, and of course, as you know, the most fire resistant of those trees is the Ponderosa pine. So anyway, you're in what we would call a mixed conifer forest. We call it a mixed conifer forest because it's got a mixture of conifers, typified by Ponderosa pine, grand fir, and Douglas fir. And incidentally, you know, grand fir, and you get down into southern Oregon and down into the Sierras, it's white fir, are really very closely related species. And what you'll find, particularly in eastern Oregon, is that there's lots of introgrades. There's lots of genetic mixing going on between them. They aren't really very distinctive species, except, of course, when you get them at the extremes of their range. But we saw grand fir on the west side, and it's got two ranked leaves, but it has really none of that gray scum or coating or glaucous bloom or whatever you want to call it on the upper surface of the needle. They're just shiny green. White fir, on the other hand, has very heavy coating of bloom on the upper surface of the needle. And so you're going to find all kinds of introgrades between the two. These kinds of forests were, well, they were quite variable, but I'm going to give you sort of the archetypical storyline for this. Historically, this was probably maintained in a relatively open forest condition by relatively frequent low-intensity fires. So this is a kind of a frequent fire environment, and the constant recurrence of fire did a couple of things. One of the things was it kept the overall density of the stands down because it would burn up, of course, the little tree seedlings and stuff, most of those that would come up. And it also tended to favor the Ponderosa pine. And so probably historically in this location, what you had was a relatively low density stand that was dominated primarily by large Ponderosa pines. And you know, that's really the very distinctive characteristic of these forests. And actually, a lot of the Ponderosa pine forests in Washington, most of them, were fire maintained. They were not climax Ponderosa pine sites. And if you remove the fire, if you suppress the fire, so that you don't get that frequent fire. Most of the pine was actually growing on sites that had Douglas fir and grand fir associated with it. And once you begin to suppress fire, those species can now begin to come on very strongly because they're not being knocked back and kept back by those frequent fire events. Douglas fir is a little bit fire resistant, but not compared to ponderosa pine. Grand fir has very, very low fire resistance. It's a very thin bark species. So anyway, we had a relatively open environment here. Pine stand, probably pretty good herbaceous cover associated with it. Grasses of various kinds. So the first thing that happened to these forests was when white settlers arrived. They brought a lot of domestic livestock with them. So in the West in general, and certainly here as well, the first really big impact on these forests was the domestic livestock in the hundreds of thousands of head of cattle and sheep that came into these forests. And they had a tremendous impact because there were so many of them that they basically ate up a lot of the grasses and other understory vegetation. And in some places like the Mogollon country down in Arizona, the southwestern ponderosa pine around places like Flagstaff, that was probably as important an event as fire exclusion. Probably wasn't quite that important here, but what it did then was it eliminated some of the fuels for the fires that had sustained those low-intensity fires, and the second thing it did was it eliminated the competition to tree seedlings. So, you know, trees didn't have to compete with a lot of grass and other herbs and low shrubs. So that was the first really big impact, and it's characteristic of all the pine forests of western North America that they had this incredible impact from the domestic livestock. Second thing, of course, that we did was we began to suppress fires because, you know, we're building ranches and things like that here, and we just had a general attitude that fire was not a very good thing. And particularly after the forest reserves were established and then transferred to the Forest Service, we began to do a very aggressive program of fire suppression. There was no sensitivity, for the most part, to the fact that different forest types have a different relationship with fire. Fundamentally, it was seen as a bad thing, and so you wanted to suppress it. So obviously that began to have very significant consequences because you could begin to get much more of a development of the more shade-tolerant species, the Douglas fir and the grand fir, which not only now could come in and begin to compete with the ponderosa pine, but also were producing incredible amounts of fuels, and fuels that had a lot of continuity to them. So you get a low fire burning through here, and it's no job at all for it to get into these intermediate fuels. And these are called ladder fuels. Okay, so you've got ground fuels or surface fuels. That'd be your grasses and your pine litter and all of that kind of thing. And then the ladder fuels are these intermediate kinds of fuels that can carry the flames from the ground into the crowns of the tree. And then, of course, you have your canopy fuels up there. In the old ponderosa pine forest, there was no continuity to speak of in the canopy fuels. There was very little in the way of ladder fuels, and the ground fuels burned very regularly. And with the suppression of fire now, the stands